A Christmas Party That Prevented a Split in the Church by Margaret Black. This was published in the Baltimore Afro American in 1916. A Christmas Party That Prevented a Split in the Church, Part 1. "Goodness," exclaimed Millie Brown. "All these things to move and dust. They're a sight, and if I had my way, I'd get rid of some of them. No single man needs all this trash around, especially a minister." "Always getting rid of something," said Sarah Simpson. "I declare, you are the limit. Perhaps you'll want to be getting rid of your daughter Alice. Now we're having a new minister, and he is a single man." "I guess you're the one who'll be wanting the minister to marry them," laughed Millie. But Sarah Simpson did not see the joke. You see, Sarah was past 30 and did not like it mentioned. Had a lovely home in town, and everybody knew she was sore at Mrs. Jake Todd because Jake preferred her when she was Margaret Clayton instead of Sarah Simpson, whose father was the leading lawyer in town and who gave his wife and daughter anything they wanted. Sarah was a pretty girl, but Margaret was much prettier and had such a sweet disposition that everybody loved her, even if she did have to wear cheap cotton dresses and her hats and coats 2 winters and couldn't afford furs. But Sarah snubbed poor Margaret every chance she got, and poor Millie Brown also, because she was Margaret's friend. Mrs. Millie Brown was a widow with only one daughter who lived beyond the town, a lonely way, and made her living by doing plain sewing. You see, there was only one church in the very small town, or you could call it a village, which would surely have insulted the small population of St. Michael's because they felt themselves very important people, and more especially now, as they were able to support a minister by themselves. No more circuit riding minister for them, since attaining the dignity of supporting a minister and having a parsonage rent-free, they had organized a mite society for the grown people and a helping hand society for the young folks and a Saturday afternoon literary society, hence the self-satisfied feeling among them. Their last pastor had been a married man with a large family, a wife and 6 children, and the poor man had so much trouble and such poor charges, which is the fate of a good many Methodist ministers, that he felt after he got to St. Michael's that he should take a rest. And he rested so well and so long that the people sent the bishop word that they did not want him back. So the good bishop have now sent them not only a young man, but a single one. And St. Michael's folks were going out of their way to make things pleasant for the new minister. He was very young and considered a genius. And as St. Michael's always have the parsonage ready furnished, and food and good parson coal and wood, they felt that since this young man, they should go a step further and stock his pantry with all things needful and have him a good housekeeper. So they had installed old Aunt Eliza West as his housekeeper. There had been a meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society and a committee for the pastor's arrival. The Board of Trustees and the Board of Stewards had also held meetings, but the Ladies' Aid had taken things in their hands, and the men were well content to step aside and let them do the work, as most of their wives belonged to the Aid Society, and those whose wives did not thought it good policy to not object. So there was just lots of help, because as Miss Orion Tucker remarked, wherever they had a married minister, all the women stayed at home, except a few old standbys who could always be depended on. But if he was a single man, every spinster young girl and married woman in town was in his evidence to help. They had all they needed and more. So they scrubbed floors, cleaned paints and windows, and swept, dusted, and polished dishes and silver until it seemed though the things would surely come to life and cry out, "Enough! Oh, enough!" or melt into nothing. At last, everything was in readiness, and St. Michael's was in a state of expectancy. Only Brother Tucker and Sister Marion Ford had attended the conference at Greenville, and neither of them could give a clear account of what he looked like. Brother Tucker said he was a pretty pert and spry-looking youngster, and Sister Marion Ford said he was a handsome young chap, straight and tall, and young poplar with the snappiest black eyes she'd ever seen, altogether quite distinguished looking. But, as Marie Phillips sarcastically remarked, you can't depend on either one of those old folks, because everybody is pert and spry to Brother Tucker, who walks and talks pretty slick. As far as Sister Marion Ford, oh sure, she can't see good anyway. But all well that ends well. And Reverend Jonathan Steele had arrived, and was quite all both Brother Tucker and Sister Ford had described, and more, some of them thought. In plain words, he came, he saw, he conquered. And after several months with the town folks, he's still the new preacher. At least he was as new as 7 months ready, where in a small town could leave him. You see, new silver does not tarnish very quickly, and Reverend Steele was still untarnished. Of course he made mistakes, and this Thursday night at the meeting of the Ladies' Aid, they were discussing the fact that Reverend Mr. Steele did not or could not seem to grasp the fact that Mrs. John Taylor was the leader of the Ladies' Aid and shining light in the church, and that Mrs. Orion Tucker was to be church treasurer for life, and that the trustees and stewards boards were composed of lifetime members, and also that Mrs. St. Anthony was the head deaconess of the church, and as her husband has donated the ground on which the church stood and donated $5,000 towards the building fund, she must be consulted on all matters pertaining to the welfare of the church. How was Reverend Jonathan Steele, not a day over 25, and a young snipe just out of college, as Mrs. Tucker emphatically declared, to realize the importance of each separate man's and woman's work in his ever-increasing congregation? Although after 7 months, if he really had failed to grasp these many-sided facts, it was no fault of the members of St. Michael's Church. Things seem to be moving along rather smoothly, remarked Mrs. Phillips. I think the Reverend has commenced to appreciate his charge, which remark was due to the fact that Reverend Steele had lately congratulated Mrs. Phillips on her executive ability. The ladies were lingering over the task of sorting out table linen and dishes after the yearly oyster supper for the benefit of the Stewards Board. Yes, said Mrs. Phillips, how our girls did work. They are coming into the church and working like soldiers, and are not near so thoughtless and silly as they used to be. Oh yes, said Mrs. Tucker sarcastically. It is really remarkable how they work. An unmarried minister can inspire so much enthusiasm amongst spinsters and women with marriageable daughters. Well, I'm not making any unkind remarks, said Mrs. Phillips virtuously. Well, replied Mrs. Tucker, neither am I. But I can't help noticing things when they happen right under your nose. I have eyes to see with, and although we might not care to spread it broadcast, we can all see the difference between the treatment according to Reverend Butler and that given Reverend Steele. You see, Reverend Butler was an antiquated married man, while Reverend Steele is a very live young man. With Reverend Butler, we crawled around the community, hardly knew we existed, while now we are increasing by leaps and bounds, fairly flying. Well, said Mrs. Phillips, it's natural, isn't it? Of course it's natural, broke in Mrs. Tucker. Life is just a succession of thrills anyway, and we all run after that which we don't have. Didn't I run a little after my old man, Orion? And didn't you run after Nathan? No, I didn't, snapped Mrs. Phillips. I never took one step out of my way for Nathan Phillips. Oh, well, you grabbed him mighty quick when he asked you. And that's what I'm thinking about these girls and old maids. Any of them could grab Reverend Steele mighty quick if he asked them. A light laugh startled them and made them turn rather quickly. They had forgotten they were in church. I'm glad my girl lives such a distance from church that she can't take part in everything. Until she does her schoolwork and helps me a little, she has no time to join church clubs and ladies' aid societies and talk scandal, said the irrepressible Millie Brown. But I guess you'll soon have a new member anyway for your society, because Hannah Burke Starks has come home and is occupying the Powell place adjoining us. You remember her, don't you, Mrs. Phillips? Well, I should say, replied Mrs. Phillips. She married young Dr. Stork of Cleveland, so she home. Is her husband with her? Oh, no, she is a widow, said Millie, and I'm thinking a pretty wealthy one at that. You don't say, said Mrs. Tucker. How you know? Well, by the style of her and the way she lives and the improvements she's making in the place. She has house servants, a gardener and a chauffeur, and a man to tend the farm, and she has had the house all done over. You won't know the place when it's finished. And she has an immense touring car and the dearest coupe she runs herself. Then she rides and has a beautiful thoroughbred horse and has just the finest of all clothes. Well, said Mrs. Phillip, that doesn't sound like she'll be much of a church worker, but we'll wait and see. You can never tell. Alice said she's lovely, replied Millie. She's been very good to Alice. We must call, said Mrs. Tucker. It is so lonely out there. Yes, it's lonely, and only Millie and her Alice for neighbors, retorted Mrs. Phillips. But I'll have to study over it first. You see, I knew Hannah before she was married, and she was always a mighty independent little piece and held her head very high. Oh, that's nothing, said Mrs. Tucker. Birds fly high too, but they always come down for water. So perhaps your Hannah was lonesome and homesick for the sight of home and old faces, and that's the reason she returned to St. Michael's. Well, we'll soon see, said Mrs. Phillips. And see they did, in a way that didn't suit St. Michael's folks at all. The following Thursday, the ladies' aid met at Mrs. St. Anthony's. They always met at Mrs. St. Anthony's whenever they could, and that was 9 times out of 10 because her home was just a few steps below the parsonage, and they could see Reverend Steele whenever he came out or in or had visitors. And then, being close, he sometimes dropped in and took tea with the ladies. Only when he came, they served cocoa and tea cakes because it was more fashionable. But this Thursday, they were doomed to disappointment because Reverend Steele came out his gate, and every girl and old maid's heart beat a little faster, and each one either took her little chamois and touched up her nose a little for fear it might be shiny, or patted her hair a little smoother, or tucked her hairpin in a little tighter. But with a gasp of astonishment, instead of turning in at Mrs. St. Anthony's and sauntering slowly up the walk as usual, he walked briskly by without so much a glance at the house. The lady aiders sat as though paralyzed, and little Marie Phillips, who thought he was on the eve of proposing to her, said, "Well, the nerve of him! I wonder where he could be going." Well, if you say so, said Lillian Tucker, I'll run and ask him. Now, girls, said Miss Sarah Simpson, don't get excited. You know a pastor of a church like ours has so many important duties to attend that he can't always attend our meetings. Don't make excuses, Sarah, retorted Mrs. Phillips. There isn't anything more important than our meetings. Stong, laughed Lillian Tucker. Perhaps he is going to see the great and beautiful Widow Stark. As though she had been a prophetess, the widow and the pastor came into view, quietly talking and seemingly interested only in each other. Everybody looked, and if only the pastor could have known each one's thought of him, who watched him so closely. The young girls were mostly amused, but the spinsters and married women were not so charitably inclined. Mrs. Stark was dressed in a fashionable tailor-made suit with hat, gloves, and shoes to match, and carried an armful of beautiful hothouse tea roses. At his gate they stopped, and she put out her hand and took his and put all the roses in them. And then she stooped and buried her face in them, as though loath to part with them. And when she raised her face, he said something to her and buried his face in them as she had done. Look, said Mrs. Sarah Simpson with a look of disgust on her face. He's kissing and caressing them because she did so. Right out in the street. Isn't it disgusting? And he seems to like her too. And here last Sunday, he took us to task about expensive clothes and street walking and flirting and love making in public and... Do hush, Sarah, said Mrs. St. Anthony. Look at the bunch of roses. It hasn't cost a cent, less than $5. I imagine I can smell them here. I wonder if he really likes roses. Mrs. Tucker seemed genuinely amused at some unspoken thought, and her quick light laugh fell jarringly upon the members. Oh dear, said one, do keep quiet. I don't see anything to laugh at, said another. Well, he likes roses well enough to keep those, said someone else. It seems so, said another. The gate clicked shut, and Mrs. Stark walked along the street, unconscious of the storm she had stirred up. If she is so intimate with him, it's a wonder she wouldn't come to church and help the church work or join the society and help to do something. And she wouldn't have time to flirt with the minister, said Mrs. St. Anthony. Has anyone, asked Mrs. Phillip, asked Hannah Stark to join our society or one of our church clubs? No one had. I'll do it now, said Mrs. Phillips. Hurry, or she'll be out of sight, they urged. They followed Mrs. Phillips to the door. Mrs. Stark had gone by, but she came back with a smile on her face, and not a little amused at being accosted thus. Mrs. Phillips stood on the top step and resolved to do what she thought was her duty. I'm Mrs. Phillips, Mrs. Stark, and you remember Hannah Burke? We saw you talking to Reverend Steele, she said by the way of introduction. We thought you might like to join our society or our Young People's Helping Hand Club. Mrs. Phillips was unaware how she spoke. Her voice cut the air like a whipsaw, and she said plainly, We don't want you, but you think it's your duty and an honor that I, Mrs. Lawyer Phillips, should ask you to join. Mrs. Stark's eyes snapped, and her head went a little higher. Thank you, she said. I feel honored. Does your pastor belong to these clubs? And is he a member of the Church Aid Society? No! Exclaimed indignant Mrs. Phillips. Then I'm sorry to decline the honor, but I can't possibly belong to anything of which he's not a member, and not under his direct supervision. She was gone, and Mrs. Phillips had to be helped in the house to the couch, and Mrs. St. Anthony was so angry she was blue in the face. I thought she would explode, and poor Miss Sarah Simpson fainted. In fact, everybody was out of commission but Mrs. Tucker, who got on everybody's nerves, laughing and said, "Ha ha! I like that woman. She got spunk and brains, enough to give you a dose of nicely sugar-coated pills that helps immensely." Before night, all St. Michael's had heard the story of the roses and the invitation to join the club, and it did not lose anything in the telling. Unconsciously, all St. Michael's formed a detective bureau to watch the pastor. They played detective and they watched poor Reverend Steele's every move. And at last, they had come to the conclusion that he was hopelessly in love with the widow. Poor Mrs. Stark. Did she know how St. Michael's regarded her? Or what they thought of her? If she did, no one in St. Michael's was any the wiser. Then one Sunday morning, just a few weeks before Christmas, Mrs. Stark appeared at church, and the latest 8 members that were present, I'm afraid, paid more attention to Mrs. Stark than they did to the sermon. In fact, I'm afraid they could not have given the sermon's text if asked. But I'm sure they could have told you all about Mrs. Stark's costume. At the Thursday afternoon meeting following, Mrs. Stark was the topic as usual. "What's wrong with her now?" said Mrs. Tucker. At first she was just a butterfly and a flirt. Then she was haughty and proud. Then she did not attend church. She was a heathen. Now she attends church. You are still fault finding, and she is a hypocrite. "What's wrong with her now?" she challenged. "Well, she's not a member," said Mrs. Phillips, "and she just came to have the pastor walk her home." "Well, whose business is it if she does? Don't you think Reverend Steele is old enough to look after himself?" said Mrs. Tucker. "Well, what do you expect of us? You'd be suspicious yourself after those roses, if you were not so in love with both her and the pastor, that it takes all your time to champion her cause and snub your neighbors, all on account of a city woman who is supposed to have plenty of money and fine clothes. I think she's bewitched you," remarked Mrs. Phillips, "as you have gone clean daft about her." "Well, I'm satisfied," retorted Mrs. Tucker. "My opinion of the matter that we will lose all the ground we've gained and waste our profits if we don't stop this unseasonable, unreasonable squabbling. Come to our senses and adjust the differences which have suddenly sprung up between the pastor and the society, all on account of attention to a woman. And we're not sure he's paying special attention to her. Because a man calls on a woman or walks home with her is no sign he wants to marry her." "Quite a sermon, Mrs. Tucker. Have you taken the Reverend Steele's place? Who elected you his champion?" sarcastically asked Mrs. St. Anthony. "Perhaps the members here are not to your liking and you wish to resign?" "I am not trying to take anyone's place," retorted Mrs. Tucker. "But 3 weeks from now is Christmas, and this is hold together time, not hold up or split up time. A similar opportunity to have a Christmas feed in the church and to get it and keep all the young folk working may never occur again, and I move we take time to forelock and get busy." "The pastor gave those roses to old Mother Carey," explained Mrs. Tucker triumphantly, "and I bet Mrs. Stark knew all about it. Perhaps she sent them by him." Said Miss Sarah Simpson. "Jonathan Steele is a sly one. Probably his pricking conscience told him the latest aide was watching." Part 2. The marriageable women of our church are nice and would be plus for any man. They are pretty and dutiful, as he'll find elsewhere, but he won't marry one of them. He can't see the pot over the sill of the window for the rain," said Mrs. Phillips. "If there was another church here, we would leave, my husband says. "And I would follow you," said Mrs. Anthony and Mrs. Ford in chorus. And then the trouble started. Reverend Still called a meeting of the Mite Society and the Latest Aid Society and organized a young people's get-together for Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. Although the three organizations consisted of 75 or more members among them, only 5 young folks and 3 old ones turned out: Millie Brown, Mrs. Tucker, and Mrs. Ford. Reverend Still made no comment on the presence or absence of the members. "Well," he said, "this will be my first meeting with you, and as you have all been faithful the past 7 months, I thought with your help we will have a Christmas this year that will leave a sweet memory to every person at St. Michael's as long as life itself. Are you willing to help?" "We certainly are," exclaimed Miss Tucker, and the rest acquiesced. Several committees were appointed, and those who were absent were notified of their appointments and the jobs they were expected to do. Some agreed half-heartedly, and some refused point blank to not only serve on the committees, but to not attend church. And a split in the Church of St. Michael's loomed large on the horizon. Sunday morning, 2 weeks before Christmas, Reverend Still preached his second formal sermon in St. Michael's Church on gossip. And truly St. Michael's was in an upheaval. No one knew if he was aware of the feelings of his congregation or not. He had chosen gossip for his subject, but in the middle of his sermon, he told his congregation that no matter what happened, even if he was to render his resignation within the next 12 hours, he would have the satisfaction of knowing that he had been a pastor and not a figurehead. He got everyone to thinking, and Mrs. St. Anthony wondered if he could rightly know what had been said about him by the Ladies' Aid. "It makes no sense if he does," said Miss Phillips. "It would do him not to know what I think of him." Said Mrs. Tucker. "Much he cares for your opinion, or any one of the rest of us, I'm thinking. He believed Reverend Butler to be led by the nose, wheresoever a set of crazy men and women choose to lead him. When Frank Coombs resigned as superintendent of the Sunday school, they thought he'd be coaxed to remain, but when no one coaxed, only a few old heads, and Harry Young was asked to fill his place. It was like stirring up a hornet's nest. Mrs. Coombs and her sister, Mrs. Cook, do come to church, but I declare they would be better at home," said Mrs. Ford. "Mrs. Cook told me," said Mrs. Phillips, "she looked at the pipes of the organ so long and so hard that she could tell everyone move on them and where with her eyes shut, and it was no wonder that they had not fallen down on her before this. Old Mrs. Lake sits with the book upside down and pretends to read when we all know she can't tell A from B, and if they were a yard high. Even when the members of the trustees and steward boards are at loggerheads because he appointed some young men who have lately joined the church on the boards and asked for the resignation of some of the old men on the board. They had been on the board so long they were moss covered." "Well, I can't see," said Mrs. St. Anthony, "why he wanted to change things around." "I can tell you," said Mrs. Tucker. "He thinks if you want to keep young people in the church after they join, you should put them to work and make them feel they want it. You see, it's useless to try to hold young folks anywhere nowadays unless they have something to do. There's too much of this wanting to be boss all the time, and a few old fogies wanting the church to stay in a rut and keeping things like they were 50 years ago. Times are changing, and you've simply got to change with them or get out of the running. A piece of antique china is admired for its age, but it is put upon the shelf for safekeeping and admired for what it was and not for its present use. So it is with us. We must either help the younger folk along or stand to be put on the shelf I say live and let live. The whole thing in a nutshell is he hasn't paid the attention to our marriageable daughters we thought he should, said Mrs. Tucker. He goes among us, love us, and thinks for our interest, which should make him loved by all. But it seemed there must always be a few discontented ones among the flock. What's the use of jangling? Said Mrs. Todd. Let us get busy. What will you give towards the Christmas feast, Mrs. Hunter? I don't know, said Mrs. Hunter. I guess 2 quarts of cream and a chocolate cake. What will you give, Mrs. Phillips? Not a single thing, she replied. Count me out of it. Mr. Phillips said, will not take part in the affair. What will you give, Mrs. Tucker? A cake, a chicken, 2 pounds of coffee, and help to do whatever I can. And you, Mrs. Ford? Mr. Ford says we'll not take part in it. Look here, ladies, before I go any further, said Mrs. Todd, let me ask you that won't help. Please do not hinder. Goodness gracious, Marjorie Todd. Put that list up and don't use the latest aid time for such foolishness, said Miss Phillips. All right, said Mrs. Todd, but I'll call on every one of you tomorrow. I can't get over that sermon, said Mrs. Anthony. Hopping back to the old subject. Neither can I, said Mrs. Phillips. There goes the Reverend and the widow now, said Mrs. Phillips. Well, that caps the climax, said old Mrs. Ford bitterly, as the Reverend and the widow passed out of sight. But she was mistaken. Something happened a few days later that threw the community into a tizzy. The whole community began to talk to each other through back doors, across to their neighbors, or talked across fences, back and front by the hour. They even called special meetings to discuss it. In fact, everybody you met was talking about it, and everybody held a squared white envelope which contained a beautifully printed white card which was drawn out and compared with other cards just like it. And soon St. Michael's awoke to the fact that every member and non-member of St. Michael's, men, women, and young people, was invited to an elaborate Christmas party. After the first surprise was over, everybody was wondering. He or she had been inviting, and one and all came to the conclusion to get in with St. Michael's folks, except the ladies' aide, who said Mrs. Stark was taken this way to show she was sorry for the way she had acted. Though Mrs. Tucker said what she had to be sorry for was beyond her. Then came the getting ready for the party. The boy that blew the mouth organ thought his checkered pants and blue coat with his new tan shoes was just the thing. The sexton's wife bought a pretty white dimity dress, much too tight, and which seemed to make her look twice as broad. But the leaders of the church, the ladies' aid, such a flurry, such a bustling. Of course, Mrs. St. Anthony, Mrs. Phillips, the lawyer's wife, and the doctor's wife, Mrs. Jameson, and Miss Simpson, and Mrs. White and their daughters could and did go to the city to get their outfit. And as well as Marie Phillips told Mrs. Tucker, the dresses will be real creations of art. But the rest of St. Michael's had to be content to buy in St. Michael's and to trust to Millie Brown, Violet Cunningham, and old Mrs. Thomas to make them. Said Mrs. Tucker, I'm mighty glad I'm invited, and I'm satisfied with any old plum-colored silk because it's no use to go to the party trying to outdress Mrs. Stark because she knows how to dress. And as Mrs. Tucker says, she could put on an old plum-colored silk and look like an angel in it, with that mop of a hair as black as a raven's ring, and eyes so black as coal, and a complexion like a rose leaf. She looks like a big doll anyway. I'll dress to suit Mrs. Tucker, who is short and inclined to stoutness and past 45, not like Hannah. with which common sense remarks. But Mrs. Tucker took her ancient plum-colored silk and sewed some real lace in the sleeves and fixed a dainty white fichu around the neck, which would tend to make her look decidedly sweet and motherly and altogether lovely. The wonderful night rolled around all too quickly. They went in conveyances of all kinds, wagons, ancient carries, buggies, Daytons, and autos all carried their quota of guests. But Mrs. Tucker and Mrs. Todd said the streetcars were good enough for them, so they accompanied Mr. Tucker and Mr. Todd. They wended their way there. Everybody went. Not one invitation was refused or ignored. They were there to eat, to listen, to enjoy, and above all, to see how Reverend Steele and Mrs. Stark would act before the people of St. Michael's. When they arrived, they were more than surprised at the display that met their gaze, and they were awed in silence. And as they gazed, they one and all thought how beautiful. Even Mrs. St. Anthony and Mrs. Phillips and Miss Sampson were who used such things, had never seen anything quite elaborate as this. Whatever else they may think, there was only one thing that could be said of her regards to the Christmas party. It was gotten together on an elaborate scale, and it was well done. When they entered, they were turned over to the maid who took them upstairs and ushered them into a room where wraps were removed and checked, and they had a chance to pin back a stray strand of hair or adjust a ribbon if they so wished. When they returned downstairs, they were announced by the butler, who was none other than young Bill Winston, hired and dressed up for the occasion, and who walked so straight and held his head so high that he wondered if he could see the folks he announced. They entered timidly in nervous little groups, following each other, sheep fashion, to the place where the hostess stood to receive them, not knowing that most of them, whether to shake hands or simply bow, nor what to do with themselves afterward. But once the hostess greeted them, they forgot their self-consciousness and their nervousness in looking at the vision of loveliness that had greeted them. She wore a lovely dress, a most wonderful gown, Mrs. Tucker said, of some sort of white stuff that looked soft, billowy clouds of fleece, dotted here and there with stones that shone like hundreds of stars and sparkled like thousands of diamonds under the blazing electric light. And old Mrs. Ford said, she made everybody feel so homey and comfortable. Well, I declare, said Mrs. Phillips, a bridal costume as I live, as she gazed at the little spray of orange blossoms that nestled so lovingly in Mrs. Stark's abundant dark hair. Do you know, said Sarah Simpson, I believe she has invited us all to her wedding. Someone whispered, isn't she glorious? And it floated from one to the other around the room. There was a gentle hum as of bees in the distance. Everyone seemed happy. I wonder where Reverend is, said old Mrs. St. Anthony. Time passed, and the older folks commenced to get restless. The younger ones were in a dreamland, and as the orchestra music was wafted so softly and temptingly on the air, the younger folks looked longingly at the waxed floor glistening in the distance and wished the pastor would not show up so they could dance. Oh, said Mrs. Phillips, just for one turn on that floor. And the rest echoed her wish. People commenced to move nervously about and to stand and talk in excited little groups. There was a hint of something in the air that no one can tell what it was. Where was Reverend Steele? Why didn't the wedding take place? Who was he going to marry? Who was going to marry them? Even Mrs. Stark was getting restless. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes fairly glistened and kept roaming toward the side entrance. Her hands played nervously with her fan. The young folks were almost tempted to ask, could they dance? The time seemed to pass so slowly, and a wave of restlessness hard to control was fast gaining possession of the guest. Everybody took cautiously watching Mrs. Stark, who was walking aimlessly here and there around the rooms and talking nervously to first one guest and then another. But it was noticed that her glance wandered continually toward the side entrance. The music itself seemed to accelerate the restlessness of the crowd. Suddenly, the music changed. As the strains of Lohengrin's wedding march pealed joyously forth, the side door was thrown wide and the footman announced in a stentorian voice, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Steele. Everybody turned to look, and there standing, framed in the doorway, smilingly stood Reverend Jonathan Steele, and standing by his side, clinging to his arm, stood his bride, timid little Alice Brown, in a simple white dress, looking for all the world like a happy brown thrush. Of course, everybody in the room could have told you that they knew it was Alice Brown the pastor had been coming out into the lonely end of town to see. And all the girls and spinsters who had held high hopes of becoming the pastor's wife will tell you that Reverend Steele is a passably good-looking man, but he is a long way from being a handsome one. Sour grapes, says Mrs. Tucker. But the ladies' aid and helping hands ladies just looked at Alice's mother, Millie Brown, and wondered to themselves how she ever kept it to herself. But it did not matter. Only to a few like Miss Sarah Simpson, whose chances of finding a husband were getting fewer each year, and to Mrs. Phillips, who was anxious to see Marie safely settled, and to Mrs. St. Anthony, who could now meddle so easily in the pastor's household affairs. To the majority, he had married a St. Michael's girl, and that was the main thing. So the church was decorated, good things donated, and the church feed was a royal reception to the pastor and his bride. And to this day, St. Michael's folk love to tell of the Christmas party and how it prevented a split in the church.